Revolution Radio proudly presents, live from the heart of the Blue Ridge, Roanoke, Virginia. It's the Just Bernard Show with host Bernard Alvarez. Join Bernard as he shares topics that reveal the real matrix and empower your human experience, including world liberty, the esoteric, suppressed technologies, spiritual ascension, and human consciousness. Humanity has awakened, and our time has come to realize our full potential. And now, live from the Star City, your host, Bernard Alvarez.
And welcome to the Just Bernard Show here on Revolution Radio. Hi, everybody. We're very happy to be here again this week. We have a very, very interesting and informative show for you today. In just a few minutes, we're going to be speaking with Maria Wheatley about the divining ancient sites and so much more about stone circles and ley lines and the power of water, good water versus bad water, and so much more. So let me tell you a little bit about our wonderful guest that is returning. Maria has been on the show in the past. It's been about a year, if not more. But let me remind you a little bit about the work that she's been doing. She is a second-generation Dowser who is a leading authority on the geodetic system of Earth energy. She was taught how to decode and divine the land by her late father, Dennis Wheatley, who is considered to be one of the United Kingdom's top Master Dowsers. Maria is an accomplished author of books on sacred sites and dowsing. She has researched the esoteric design canons of prehistoric sites, druidic ceremonial enclosures, and the Knights Templar for many years. Maria has studied Neolithic Britain and Bronze Age prehistory with the University of Bath, and alongside other professionals, Maria combines her knowledge of archaeology and earth energies with state-of-the-art equipment to locate and detect the hidden frequencies that the Earth emits. Maria is also going to be doing a tour here, well, not here, I wish it was there, in Ireland, in the UK in a couple of weeks, and we're going to be talking about that in just a few moments. So without further ado, welcome back to the show, Maria. How are you today?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. I'm very well, thank you.
Well, we're very glad to have you. You always have so much information and have actually really reminded me and or not taught me more than what I thought I knew. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing, especially since you get to be on the ground there and go to these places yourself. Maria, just a little bit, what was it that drew you to the work? Was it your father's work that you found fascinating, decided to carry on with it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I was thrilled to go to these, wonderful places full of mystery and full of intrigue, like Stonehenge and Avebury and Silbury Hill and Serpent Mound, actually, in America, I've been to with him. So it was going to these sites and then, literally feeding the energies with dowsing rods and your hands and even your feet, like when you ground these places. So I became more and more intrigued the older and older that I got. And I realized, there's so much more to the land and its land harmonics. And that's what I've been exploring. I've been exploring earth energy and water energy as well to see how they affect our consciousness, our physical bodies, and basically our lives and the land upon which we live.
That's just wonderful. And just so for our listeners and for my sake, are you joining us today from Avebury, or where are you at exactly today?
Well, I'm just outside of Avebury, about sort of 10 minutes away. I think if I lived amid that energy 24/7, I probably could be cuckoo by now.
I hear you. I hear you. I can imagine. I've been there myself with that energy, but not that particular energy, but any energy. Tell us a little bit about what dowsing is, because I just want to make sure that our listeners are caught up to the conversation we're going to start having here in just a moment. Can you explain a little bit of what dowsing is and how it's done and your method of doing it, perhaps.
Sure. When we think of dowsing, it conjures up the idea of a person walking around with a hazel kind of Y-shaped twig, water divining. And that's a kind of very old-style way of divining for water and locating water. And traditionally, a hazel rod was used in the shape of a wild willow because they were deemed by ancient Druid communities to be sacred wood, holy wood, with an affinity to the moon and to water. So that's why those old-style rods were used. And even if you use them today, they are very, very effective. Today, though, in modern dowsing terms, we tend to use what's called an L rod, made of metal. You can use brass, for example, and I think a lot of American dowsers use brass. And we over here, we use brass as well, but we also mix that with copper because copper is quite a good, conductive material. It can pick up on energies quite fast and conduct energies as well. So my dowsing rod, my tool of the trade, if you will, is an L-shaped copper rod, and that's very sensitive. The part that I hold in my hand has what's called a sleeve, so my hand isn't actually influencing the rod. And we program a rod to detect something. Because, for example, if I'm at an ancient site and I'm walking around with my dowsing rod would be going into the found position. That's normally when it swings towards me. It's saying, hey, I found something. But you have to decode, that which you find, because the Earth emits a lot of different patterns. For instance, the Earth is surrounded by a grid system called the Curry net, and the Benker grid, and the Hartmann grid. And the Curry net throws out energy lines in the shape of literally a grid. Imagine sort of rectangular shapes. Every 3.5 meters, there's a grid called the Curry net.
Mm.
So if I was walking around and I didn't know that, I could think, I hit a ley line, I've hit this. But after you've kind of just mastered a few different things that you've been shown to douse, you easily recognize what you're dousing. So if I thought I was picking up on a curry line, I could use information dowsing and ask my rod if that was a curry line, or I could walk 3.5 meters, and if it crossed again, guarantee 100% you're on that curry net. And to live above that curry net can be quite detrimental towards your health, because it was discovered by Dr. Manfred Curry in the 1950s, because he began to realize that where he took a blood sample affected the actual blood sample itself. So he played around with the idea, and with lots of research, and in a nutshell, he discovered the Curry net. Where the two lines cross, imagine there's a crossing point on that net, that is very detrimental for your health. In fact, there was a big survey done in Germany involving 8,000 patients, and it was discovered that 1/3 of those control groups were in hospital or admitted to hospital because of an illness due to geopathic stress. And geopathic stress is basically living above negative earth energies, if you will. So, you can douse for many things. You can douse for things in your home using an L rod, or you can douse for more profound things like ley lines and earth energies, and then build up a kind of rapport of what you know that you can douse for. And then you can move on to, say, douse for harmonic energies, like particular types of water. You can start to decode what's good for you and what isn't good for you. And let's face it, if modern day building companies employed a dowser or a geomancer prior to their actual building phase, we could be living in harmony with the earth. We could be avoiding grid lines, we could be avoiding underground water or harmonizing those areas. And as that German survey said, 1/3 less people would be in hospital due to geopathic stress. And that's a high number of people around the world in hospital that don't need to be.
Yeah, it certainly is. And when you say geostress, for lack of a better term,
Geopathic stress.
Geopathic stress. What are some of the symptoms of geopathic stress?
Yeah, well, if you're interacting with geopathic stress, let's say you're living above it in a house, 9 times out of 10, you're going to be waking up inexplicably, probably about between 2 and 4 in the morning. And you'll wake up, when you do wake up, you'll feel tired, you'll feel apathetic, you'll be more prone to, petty illnesses like colds and coughs. It will take you longer to recover from those petty illnesses. And also, some people will grind their teeth. That's a really good sign that you're above geopathic stress. And children are really good indicators as well, as indeed your own body is. You might avoid a certain part of your bed because your body knows what's good for you. You might be avoiding a particular area because it is under geopathic stress or above geopathic stress. So there are indications of that, and well-being. You actually feel good about going to bed. You'll feel good about yourself when you wake up. With geopathic stress, you kind of feel not quite right about where you live, and most people recognize something's wrong.
Very, very interesting, and I can't help but wonder. I had a lot of. I'm going to get a little personal here, but I just want to say that during my time growing up in South Florida, and I don't know if you know I guess the geography of South Florida. There's a lot of limestone with underwater, I guess, channels or whatnot. And to this day, I still have, for lack of a better term, nightmares about the house that I grew up in. And how it affected me. It was very lots of drama involved, and not necessarily teenage stuff, but how shall we say, emotional, very emotional. A lot of dark energy is what I felt there. Even as an intuitive, I felt a lot of dark energy there. But I'm wondering if that has anything to do with, again, the underwater channels and the limestone in Florida. Is that common for that area? Do you know, or of that type of area, I should say?
Well, because I give Skype lessons on dowsing, a lady from Florida actually, and she lived again above quite marshy ground. She was describing it as actually quite waterlogged. And when we think about what water means metaphysically, it has memory, doesn't it? That's a premise of homeopathy. All water has memory. So if there has been emotionally charged energy released, anger, hate, or whatever that kind of emotional charge is, it will register in the kind of land and especially in the area where that underground water flows. And it's almost like a tape recorder. It will play over and over that scene. And there was a Master Dowser over here called Tom Lethbridge, and he looked into this principle of water, hauntings, and feeling, apathetic at certain places. And he realized that around underground water, with the right atmospheric conditions, for example, like fog or mist, something where the weather is kind of on the turn, it will produce and reenact whatever happened before. And sometimes even, and he caught one very good photograph, I don't know if it's on the net, of where the mist was actually forming into a figure, it was found with research that was down to a haunting. So water can be good for us, if we live above positive water, which we'll describe later, or like yourself, you really felt there was something wrong. And that's what I mean about geopathic stress. Kids, intuitives, sensitives, and even kind of your most corporate type of person on the planet, left brain, they all recognize if somewhere is good or not to live. It's a fundamental instinct deep within our psyche.
Absolutely. And now let me ask you, Maria, just again, for the benefit of our listeners, can you explain a little bit about the different water systems that are beneath us? Besides, there's water tables, there's underground rivers. Can you explain a little bit just to give us a broader picture of what we're talking about here? Where does the water come from? Is it rainwater? Is it from a well, or
Sure. That's a really good question, and it's one that we should really be taught in schools. I mean, again, going back to kind of my heritage, if you will, being a second-generation water diviner, I was always taught from a very young age there are two different types of water, as indeed most water diviners know. And that The first type of water we're all familiar with. It falls from the clouds and it fills up the water tables, and it will make aquifers deep underground. And some of that rainwater fell in the Jurassic period, so we have some very ancient, aquifer water. And quite often this is coined as a nickname, yang water, because it falls from the sky, from the sky, if you will. So that's one type of water. Now, where that water flows, and if you live above it, all geomancers worldwide, all dowsers worldwide categorically say that it's carcinogenic to live above. It's not good. Long-term exposure will weaken your immune system. And when your immune system is weakened, any genetic disease you're prone to has more potential to manifest. It gives off a particular pattern that is easily identifiable through dowsing. Imagine just like a river flowing on the surface. We can all visualize that now in our minds. There a river flows. And imagine that now to be underground. But where that is above the ground, you have 3 lines of force flowing. Now, let's say about 3 or 4 feet apart. You have one line, 3 or 4 feet, next line, 3 or 4 feet, the next line. And it's called a triad water stream line. That's how you identify that type of water. You'll get 1, 2, 3 dowsing reactions. And actually, if you carried on walking, and let's say I walked another 25 feet, just walking ahead, and I pick up on that same pattern again, that same 3 lines, 1, 2, 3. The distance I have walked, say 25 feet for argument's sake, means that that underground stream that I initially doused is 25 feet beneath me. It's called the Bishop's Rule. It's a very ancient way of depth in water, for example. So that's considered negative geopathic stress type of water. And it's common and it's frequent, especially in porous rocks. You mentioned limestone, for example. I come from a chalk downland, and that's equally as porous as limestone. But nonetheless, even in hard rock areas, you will get water. The other type of water is generated deep within the Earth herself, because a planetary body like the Earth can generate her own water. And I've been saying this for years, and I was thrilled recently when it was all over Facebook and the internet that yes, the Earth produces water. Rocks can produce water. And indeed, there is more water beneath the Earth's mantle than there is in all of the oceans above ground. And it's perpetual. I mean, the thing about this type of water that the Earth generates deep within her being, if you will, is it's perpetual. So when in the future, say for argument's sake, a government tells us we're running out of water, it's an impossibility, because there's always been noted throughout history, generation after generation, this is perpetual water. And you can recognize this water. It is deep underground. It comes up under high pressure. And just recently, there was a Dr. Gerald Pollack. He looked into what's called the 4th phase of water, because water can be liquid, it can be gas, it can be solid, as in ice. And he was saying, well, there's a 4th phase, and it's called exclusion zone water, easy water. And basically, that water is really, really good for us. It's alkaline, and it has a negative charge. It's like when you ground yourself. You're on the ground, you get a negative charge through your body. So, and he calls this water not H2O, but H3O2. So there are 2 distinctive types of water, and we recognize this as dowsers by the spiral pattern it emits. It emits a particular shape of spiral pattern. All animals are attracted to it. Animals will give birth on it, and their offspring will be healthier. It gives off a really energetic Schumann resonance, 7 hertz energy field. And all old farmers in England, they had a saying, build your farmstead where the sheep doth lie, because sheep and animals congregate on these energy patterns in the earth, and they feel safe and they feel completely protected within this energetic field. So it's healthy for us. We've measured it with equipment. It is good. It will make your brain, and sometimes, boy, do we have stuff going on in our heads, don't we? So when we go to a sacred site, it just brings us down to that 7 hertz alpha frequency, naturally, just by being around its field. Now imagine if we had that in hospitals. Imagine that if we had it in prison walls. Imagine how we could live just by integrating these energies naturally by the buildings upon which we live. Because if you build in a particular way, in a dome shape, or in a pyramid shape, you enhance the energy. So there's great potential for the future. I mean, I just taught a young chap to dowse. He's a designer of children's parks, actually, in London and around our capital here in the UK. And he's going to be incorporating these type of energies into play parks and play areas for children, so that they can, really attune to the energy that they're playing above, feel relaxed and feel good and feel positive.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so there's a million and one ways we can use dowsing, and we can look at these type of earth waters and think, wow, if they emit a good energy field, what can they do to us? And what are we made of? Water.
Well, we're all made of water and carbon, of course.
Yeah, yeah. So again, I've been working with these energy patterns in our own body water because, and this is probably going to sound very controversial, because our brains record memories. Of course they do. I mean, that is a scientific fact. But it has never been looked into whether our own body water can record, just like homeopathic people that have studied how they make remedies and looked into the fact that water does have memory, rather. What if our own body water retains memory? We've been looking at ways where we can kind of use these energy patterns through meditation, and very simple meditations, to kind of clear and refresh our own body water. And a lot of people feel a big benefit once that's done. It's almost like they've kind of been metaphysically washed in a kind of way at sacred sites. And I think that's one way the ancients may have used the underground water's emitted energy fields.
That sounds very fascinating, especially the idea that our own body water retains the memory of a specific, whether it be crises or events in our life. I am a Reiki master, and I do teach classes on chi energy. And one of the things that I talk about is to one of the in one of my lessons, I teach everyone how to identify the chi energy blockages in their body, and I can't help but wonder if that would somehow overlap with our body water, remembering it and holding it in one specific part of our body. What do you think about that? Just postulating here.
That's absolutely. It's amazing that you're kind of so switched onto it, because that's what we've been kind of doing over here in groups. We've been looking at where in my body. I mean, we've all had trauma in our lives,
Yeah.
And where do I hold on to that? And when we kind of looked at trauma, emotional trauma, this is. It's just will be in a certain part of the body, and it's almost like that is the kind of water memory. And again, I feel very strongly that in the future we will be looking at water in a completely different way, and we'll be looking at our own bodies, because we may appear solid, and of course we are, but in a way we're very fluid. We're more water than we are anything else, and if we kind of can refresh and replenish our memories and our body water, then I'm sure we will feel healthier in many, many different ways. And people have benefited from this. And I met some American authors, actually, called Peer and Cullen, and they too were working with body water and the underground waters. And I showed them the different types of underground water you can get. And again, they have had great healing results by standing above water, preferably at an ancient site. You can do this anywhere and tune into it, and then just imagine, that where in your body are you holding on to things that can be in strange places, and that's what we work on.
I love it. I think it's definitely the direction that we need to go into as far as healing our body. I don't have time to go too much into this, but we did have a guest here recently, Jeff Harvey. I don't know if you've heard of him before, but he's a former Navy intelligence that is now doing healing, creating healing devices, creating healing work, and healing a lot of people. But he himself actually went into an illness where his kidneys were shutting down, and they had given him a couple days to live. And someone had brought to his attention the H3O. I don't know if it's H3O or H3O2, and he started drinking it, and he's getting his eyesight back. He's getting his vitality back. He's still here, 7 months later, so it goes to show you that how healing water can be, no matter what the chemical makeup is. I would suggest,
Absolutely, and I think this is what the ancients were fully aware of, because at ancient sites in the UK, you can have some stones, we call them scoops or basin stones, where they've been kind of, hollowed out, if you will, just like a bowl.
Oh, we're going on a break, Maria. I'm sorry. We'll be right back after this message.
And now, back to your host, Bernard Alvarez.
Welcome back to the Just Bernard Show here on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Today we were speaking with Maria Wheatley, who's joining us live just out of Avebury. And we were just talking about how the ancients did use water for healing, Maria, before we came on the break. Could you remind us a little bit of what you were saying?
Yeah, sure. When we look at our ancient sites, some of the stones, even like places at Stonehenge actually, had basins made into them. So they were literally like bowls. Yeah. And it looked like, because they're smooth, that they've held at some point water. So it could be that the ancients were fully aware that if you place water, any sort of water, above this type of underground energy field, it's believed like it's like alchemic. It can transmute the properties of the water that's placed above it. So they could have been using that in that way, and this is why you get a lot of what we call stoops and basin bowls around the place in strange places. I mean, for example, Avebury and Stonehenge were familiar with some of those sites. The stones from the Marlborough Downs, I live just near Marlborough, and just kind of about 2 or 3 miles away from me, imagine field after field after field with gigantic stones in them. It's called the Valley of the Stones. It's the motherland of Avebury and Stonehenge. That's where the stones were transported from. Now, some of those stones have big scoops in them, one of which was on a place called Temple Down. And it's called Temple Down because the Knights Templar had a chapel there, for example, high on the downs in the middle of nowhere, and they had this gigantic stone. Imagine a stone just as big as Stonehenge, about 2 feet thick. And sarsen, by the way, is second in hardness only to diamond. So it's very difficult to work. And you need another sarsen to panel it if you want to, make it smooth. You can't use metal, it will instantly blunt. So it's very hard. And this stone on the Downs at Temple Farm, which was associated with the Knights Templar and probably predates the Knights Templar of the 12th century. Probably before that was Neolithic, undoubtedly. Gigantic stone with a huge basin in it. They call it the Templar's Bath. Going through 2 feet of hard rock, like I said, second to diamond, you have a pentacle shape, which was acted like a plug hole through 2 feet. How they did that in times gone by is one of the mysteries of the ancient world. And that was filled up with water, and it was like some ancient rite to, be bathed in the Templar's Bath, as it's called. And it's on private property. You can't, visit it unless you have permission by the landowner to do so. But one thing that we noticed, I arrived at the Templar's Bath, and it's flint and chalk where Avebury and I live, and I fell over on a piece of flint. It's very, very sharp. It's like a surgeon's knife, and I literally sliced part of my palm, and it was bleeding, and so I arrived with dripping blood, thinking, oh goodness me. And we went to the Templar's Bath. It had the water in it. And very carefully, I just kind of, placed a bit of water around the cut, and it did seem to soothe it in some way. It probably would have been soothed anyway, but it's been renowned in that area for its healing magical properties. It's legendary in this area. So again, it's like the legends and the myths, and sometimes they're like the holy history of the land, are contained in these old stories which have some resonance of truth. some fantasy, but some resonance of truth. And I think this is the idea behind the stones placed above an energy pattern that can somehow interact with that water. And again, it's just a matter of time and getting the right equipment to prove these ancient truths are a reality and not a figment of a Dowser's or an esoteric researcher's imagination.
Yes, absolutely. And you actually, you have, I'm not sure if you've worked with Brian Forster, but he's one that seems to be trying to explain some of this, misunderstood information that we seem to be getting. Have you gone to Stonehenge or any of these places with him? And
No, I haven't with him actually. I have with other authors at Megalithomania because I'm often their guide.
Right,
so
right.
I've been in with like Michael Tellinger
Yeah.
and other authors alike, but just not him. But I'm familiar with his work, and interestingly, in the last couple of years, the archaeologists here had a project called the Riverside Project actually, and they found some skulls very much like the Mayan, bound skulls, which makes an elongated skull in the Stonehenge environs. There were 6. So in Stonehenge, they were sharing some kind of cultural identity or a cultural person type of genetics going on in this area, and that was unexplained by the archaeological community.
Unbelievable. Yeah, we seem to be learning so much more about, I would say, our true selves more and more every day, especially with the work that you're doing and the work of everyone at Megalithomania and Brian Forster and whatnot. I'm on your website right now, and I can't play it because we're on the air, but I see that they had you on UFO Hunters. What were they? What was that show? The subject matter for that show?
It was vortexes and the grid system, and we were at Stonehenge, and they're absolutely brilliant, the UFO hunters. I mean, I think they're adorable, and they're good research as well. Now, what they wanted from me was to have a look at ley lines, have a look at grid lines, and have a look at vortexes. Well, hey, Stonehenge has got it all.
Yes, I bet.
It's on the grid. It has everything. It's a university of learning about energy. And what they wanted to do was to test out dowsing. And Pat, one of the chaps, I showed him where the line was, and he got it. Then the kind of left brain chap, I think it was called Jeff, he said, "Oh no, you've influenced him. Your suggestion that it's there made the rods cross." And okay, that's a good point. So they began to test it out. They blindfolded a person. The person didn't know where the ley line was, and lo and behold, the rods crossed. They found it. So then they thought, well, what if we take a dowsing rod out of the person's hand and put it on some kind of contraption? It was like a pole, so it became independent, and walk across the line. What would happen? Could the rod independently pick it up without a human holding it? And it couldn't. But as soon as you put it into contact with the human hand, if you will, the lays were found. So we were experimenting with dowsing on lots of different levels to see if we could, really fathom what was going on. And with blindfolding as well, I mean, that was a really good test that the UFO hunters done, because it doesn't matter. Once you're in that energy field and you're holding a rod, you'll find it. And also Bill, the kind of anchorman of the UFO hunters, he wanted to have a look at the vortex energy. I mean, because they were linking it into UFO activity. And indeed, there is a lot of UFO activity around Stonehenge. And I want to point out, where Stonehenge is. Yes, it's a sacred site, but it is surrounded by up to 10 military army bases. Yeah, and that's what a lot of people don't know about Stonehenge, unless you're kind of a local lass like me, so to speak. But it's surrounded by military base after military base. And right on a ley that links Stonehenge with another sacred site nearby called Avebury Rings. It's like a huge earthen circle just of earthworks. A very powerful place. That is right by what's called Porton Down, and that's our nuclear biological centre. Half of it is underground, and the line goes right the way through that. And you just can't enter that place. Obviously, it's like our Area 51. Stonehenge is on the Salisbury Plain. It's inaccessible. It's a military secret zone. You can't just walk off on the Salisbury Plain. You'll have an army officer taking you out. And there's millions of sacred sites well, not millions, there are lots and lots of sacred sites on the Salisbury Plain that are totally inaccessible. That's Stonehenge today.
You can't. You're stimulating my conspiracy theorist, because I can't help but think or feel that apparently the military knows how to perhaps access or work with some of these ley lines or sacred sites, and maybe perhaps that's why they're putting these installments, so close by. I just can't help but think about that.
It is no coincidence that Stonehenge was surrounded by military establishments. I mean, if you go, this is why it was such a nonsense, them saying they had to take the road out, and they want to take another road out so that they're completely in control of Stonehenge. There's one vein left where you and I could walk without going to English heritage. One vein left, and they want to take that over as well. So, they really do know the dynamics of Stonehenge. That's how it is. And just a mile away, if I pointed it out to you, I don't do spiritual pilgrimages, but if I pointed out one way, say, yeah, that's Lark Hill, that's a huge military base over there, and to the left of me, there's another huge military base. But I know some of the personnel, the military personnel they've left now. They've also experienced some very strange things around Stonehenge. The vein, or the track, that is hopefully not going to be closed off. It runs right on a ley, dead straight. If you see it on a map, it goes right the way through the Salisbury Plain, the equivalent of our Area 51. It whoosh across the landscape. Anyway, two army chaps, they decided to park on these called the Cursors track, and have a couple of cigarettes and a couple of beers. They weren't drunk or anything, and they were just chilling out. And this light appeared from nowhere. Now, these are trained observers. They start to triangulate, looking at about where this light came from, and it just disappeared. Then it came back again, and they thought, well, that's a bit strange. And they left. Well, as soon as they arrived on barracks, like I say, it was just a mile away, it's called Lark Hill. And they arrived there, and they were instantly arrested, absent without leave. And they're saying, what? We've just had a couple of tinnies, we call them. We had a couple of tinnies, a couple of cigarettes. That's all that happened. No, you've been absent without leave for 3 days. You're in the can, as they say. There's been lots of stories like that and anecdotal reports around Stonehenge on that particular track, which is a ley, or ley line as it's commonly called, that has to do with time distortion. So that is, and that's what the UFO hunters were interested in as well. The vortex are the energy, the lines that go into Stonehenge, they seem to be able to distort time in inexplicable ways that we don't understand fully.
Wow, so they saw this light come and go momentarily, and meanwhile it had been 3 days.
Yeah, exactly. And they realized that when they touched their faces, and one said, yeah, and suddenly he touched stubble. And he thought, they still to this day don't know what happened, and they don't want to be regressed. It did change their lives. One is now an actual spiritual tour guide. It
That's
changed
great.
his life. He didn't want the military. He saw through it. So for him, I think it was a good experience.
Absolutely. Sometimes you need to be shaken up a little bit to expand your consciousness, so to speak. Maria, let's talk a little bit. We only have about 10 minutes left on this segment, but can we talk about, you're talking now about the ley line system around Stonehenge, but tell us a little bit about your research that you've been doing on the planetary ley system that was discovered over 200 years ago. That nobody talks about.
No. In about sort of 1846, there was a very rich antiquarian. An antiquarian is like an old-fashioned archaeologist. Basically, you had lots of money, you could dig where you want because you were the landowners, and they were called antiquarians. One of the antiquarians was called the Reverend Edward Duke. And his grandfather, actually, he was there, always been into archaeology. And Edward Duke's grandfather found one of the largest skulls in the Stonehenge environ. It was gigantic, and he took it out of what's called a burial mound. They're like round mounds that surround Stonehenge in gigantic circles. And anyway, it was a gigantic skull, and he put it in the local church, and people used to touch it for good luck. I've been trying to track that down, actually, with the British Museum and with the local museum, and hit nothing, because it could be like the Nephilim or something. I don't know what it is, but it's worthy of research. But that's apparently gone missing from the British Museum. Gosh, where they go missing to, I don't know. But Edward Duke, the younger Edward Duke, he was like all antiquarians, whether it was William Stukely, he recorded Stonehenge and Avebury, John Aubrey, they recorded and did a lot of antiquarian pictures, old-style pictures, and thankfully they did, because we know what the site looked like then to what they look like now. So they gave a lot of information. They all have one thing in common, apart from being rather rich. They were all Freemasons. So they were privy to documents that maybe you and I couldn't have access to in that era. Now, William Stukely came out with the idea of the Serpent Temple for Avebury, for example, and he never said where he got that from. But again, he probably got that from a much, much ancient manuscript, as did Edward Duke. And what Edward Duke saw was a huge line. And bear in mind, the huge line that he saw in the landscape, which we call lays today, were only rediscovered in the 1930s by Alfred Watkins, who termed the phrase lay. For Edward Duke, all those years ago, he looked at the ancient landscape and saw a line. The line linked Avebury to Stonehenge, and it had other sites lined upon it in a particular distance that mirrored where the planets may have once been in the skies above. So it was the planets of the solar systems that the ancients looked at and brought down to Earth and mirrored the sites. For example, William Stukely always called Avebury the Temple of the Sun and the Temple of the Moon. And yes, it has solar alignments, and yes, it has lunar alignments, but nobody knew why he called it that. In Edward Duke's model, that he claimed he got from an older manuscript, was the Temple of the Sun and the Moon. And further on down the line, you have Mercury, represented by a long barrow, which archaeologists call them long barrows. I mean, they're clearly more than a place of burial. That was their secondary and final use. Long before the bones were placed in there, they were like initiation chambers, it's believed, or maybe had other purposes and been multifaceted. There was Mercury placed on that point where Mercury would have been in the skies. And as you go further on down the lane, for example, you come to a place called Marden. Now, den, whenever you see that in Old English villages and towns, is an old word for settlement. Marden, the temple of the settlement of Mars, the town of Mars. Marden Henge, there's nothing left of it today, sadly so, because it was a gigantic superhenge. It was bigger than Avebury. It had a huge mound in it. It was a ceremonial place. And interestingly, with the latest archaeological digs, they found sweat lodges there, like in the Native American culture. They found complex houses. This was a sophisticated town at one time. It was a settlement. And Marden, the settlement of Mars. And as you move further on down the lay, you come to Jupiter, for example. And that's right on the edge of the Salisbury Plain, our little area 50, area 51, if you will. Mm-hmm. And it's really high. It's a gigantic Druid core. Now, a Druid core means university, a place of learning, for example. And it's the largest core, or hill fort as they're commonly called, in Wiltshire, and Jupiter's the largest planet in the solar system, and just by that ancient core is another gigantic mound, which is the largest in Europe, actually, which could mirror Jupiter. So these ancient cores were places of gathering and places of learning, and it's of no mistake that Oxford University, I'm sure many listeners, even if they're not Brits like me, have heard of Oxford University and Cambridge. Well, Oxford is cited on an ancient Druid core. Yeah, so they used to be. Wow. It was a university then to the ancient Druid community here, those masters of nature. And old-style alchemists, long before the medieval period, and so is Oxford University today, and that's Jupiter. So all of these sites were laid out, and Stonehenge is at the south end and represents the planet Saturn. Now Saturn, as most astronomers and astrologers as well would tell you, Saturn takes 30 years to make one complete orbit of the zodiacal signs. That's the 12 zodiac signs. Mm-hmm. It would take roughly 29, 30 years in which to do so. Well, at Stonehenge, the symbolism of Saturn is therein because there's 30 standing stones going round in a perfect circle with 30 lintels on top that fits into the symbolism of representing Saturn. And also Saturn is Kronos, he's Father Time. Mm-hmm. And again, I was mentioning the time distortions that happened there. So they were the 7 known planets, and I'll describe the Temple of Venus later on. They were the known planets in Edward Duke's era, and he drew them out on a line. And I thought to myself, and to an astronomer actually, called Lawrence Upton, well, you know, in Duke's era, he hadn't heard of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, because Pluto had only been rediscovered in the 1930s. What if we extended the line north and south? Would planets representing sacred sites be found in the exact astronomical units they would be in the skies? Because Uranus is so many astronomical units away from the sun and Earth, etc., etc. So we did this as just kind of, you know, an experiment to see what would come up. And we were astonished to find that at those exact places on the map where they should occur, they did indeed occur with the most amazing sacred sites. So what does that tell us? That tells us one thing, that the ancients were fully aware of the planets long before the telescope was discovered. It cannot be happy chance that you have a wondrous site called Bellis Nap. It's in a place called Gloucestershire, and Bellis Nap is like a horned barrow. It's very, very unusual. Again, I use the term barrow, but I really don't want your listeners to think it's all about death and burial, because that was, like I said earlier, that was its secondary usage. Because something went down in our landscape. Something happened around 2500 BC, because throughout Europe, and especially in the UK, our ancient ancestors decommissioned, closed down, and infilled every single barrow in the land. Yeah, they pushed in earth, very neatly so, and so jam-packed and tight.
Well, excuse me, Maria, we have to take a short break, and when we return, please remember where you left off. This is very fascinating. We'll be right back.
And now, back to your host, Bernard Alvarez.
Welcome back to the Just Bernard Show here on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. We're having a great conversation today with Maria Wheatley on divining ancient circles, ley lines, earth grid, and so much more. Before we went on the break, Maria was talking to us about what happened in the is it the Avebury area that they began to rebury or cover up some of these sacred sites?
Well, what happened was, around about 2500 BC, you had a monument which archaeologists deem a long barrow. It's a long mound with megalithic chambers in. Some don't have megalithic chambers, but most do. Now, around the 2500 period, the ancients decided, not just in the Avebury area, but all over the UK at the same time, to infill and decommission these monuments. That's when they put skulls in all probability, and the long bones, so it looked like a burial chamber, yeah, because they were closing them down. It's called, in archaeological terms, the decommissioning of ancient sites of the Neolithic period. That's its technical term. But what was happening was something must have gone down, whether that was climatic or a change or a cultural. Something really changed the consciousness of our ancient ancestors, because they did this all over England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. And they infilled those long barrows after placing skulls in so perfectly that it wasn't until around about the 1950s in my local area near Avebury that Professor Atkinson dug down into one chamber and actually found the chamber infilled. They didn't even think it was there. That's how. And then Then, in a true Indigo Jones style of grand finale, they took these gigantic sarsen stones, some of which were weighing up to 70 tons, and sealed it for all time in like a bump, and sealed it off so nobody could ever enter them again. That's what they were doing all over the British Isles at the same time. And that has never been addressed by most researchers other than myself and a few archaeologists that are now questioning and re-looking back and thinking, what happened? What motivates people to do that? Then they started redesigning some of the stone circles that we're familiar with today. So it's one of those real mysteries of the ancient British landscape. What happened and why?
If I can speculate a little bit, I can't help but want to speculate. I
Sure.
can't. I'm wondering, is there any correlation perhaps to the fall of the Egyptian egalitarian priesthood, whereas let us say the quote unquote, I'll just say the Illuminati because that's the only word people know nowadays, but I mean the dark priesthood kind of came into power. I wonder if it was something intuitive that they were trying to hide these powerful places from the greedy and the self-serving priesthood at the time.
In all probability, I think you could be very, very correct in that assumption, because we know that, like in other parts of the world, something was changing, wasn't it? Whether you call it dark or overpowering or that rulership really coming in. And in the British Isles, they really did change that off. And another intriguing fact about the very ancient Britons, and I'm talking when we were an island, but one time rather, we were connected to the continent, like France. And then in around about 6000 BC, England became an island. When they were looking at the skulls that came out of these long barrows, they were different to our European skulls. I mean, I'm looking at your picture on Skype, and I could say to you, you've got a European skull. Yeah, I've got a European skull. We have similar ancestors, probably. And you tend to be slightly rounded in skull shape. Now, the ancient Britons, those that were found in the long barrows, once the archaeologists redug them out, so to speak, they were much longer than the standard Europeans that were coming out of the much later round barrows, which were probably erected around 2000 BC, if we use orthodox dating system. I don't necessarily agree with that, but we have to have a starting point. So the later barrows had more round skulls, and the earlier barrows had much more longer skulls. And so they did a kind of nickname phrase. Oh, long skulls come out of the long barrows and round skulls come out of the round barrows. And that was an ancient way to learn about the different skulls coming out of the barrows in archaeological classes. So it's almost like around about 2500 BC, there was categorically an influx of people from Europe that were slightly different to the ancient Britons.
That's fascinating, and just a footnote. I believe you're probably looking at Treva's picture. I don't think I have a picture up there on Skype.
Yes, you're right. You're absolutely
and
right.
Treva is Treva. What are you? German and English, I believe.
There you go.
German, English, and my family name came from Denmark.
Okay.
So I'm not really sure. I'm guessing
You're definitely Northern European.
You're definitely European.
And you're Canadian as well, so you have a true connection to the UK there.
Wow.
But let me ask you a little bit about the building of Stonehenge, and did they choose to build? You said you had mentioned something earlier about Jupiter. Did you feel that they wanted to place Stonehenge there? Was there specific ley lines, specific energy there for them?
Yes, I mean, Stonehenge, take away the stones, it's a power place. And by that I mean, the land itself is very, very powerful there. And like I said earlier, the UFO hunters, it has a vortex at the near center, and it has numerous lines converging at Stonehenge and leaving Stonehenge. It's like a gateway. It's like a gigantic portal energy zone, if you will. And so that's the kind of land harmonics there. And really fast flowing lays, for example, they flow in a kind of particular shape. Again, everything like has its shape. And they really flow fast into Stonehenge. And that's quite unusual because some are lays and earth currents, they're meandering and they're slow and they can be kind of relaxed, if you will. But these ones really flow very, very fast into Stonehenge. And it's very interesting to note that the first stone to be erected at Stonehenge actually wasn't erected. It was buried deep, deep in the ground. So that was the first way of Stonehenge. They actually pushed a stone down into the ground. Again, it's an archaeological anomaly that archaeologists like to ignore because it doesn't fit the frame, so to speak. So Stonehenge was sited above that kind of power place. And it underwent many, many different phases as well. I mean, the first phase of Stonehenge, for example, had a henge, that's a ditch and a bank, with a big ditch on the outside, and a large wall of chalk block. Imagine like bricks. Chalk blocks are gigantic bricks, and it would have gleamed chalk white. It would have been noticeable for miles and miles and miles, inside of which was a stone circle containing 56 blue stones from Wales. And Wales is about 170 miles away, so they transported the stones. You know, I mean, you visit the visitor centre at Stonehenge, and you know it would make you angry actually, because they have this now gigantic fiberglass stone wrapped around with ropes, and they're really, you know, selling to the public that visits Stonehenge the heave-ho pulling across the landscape. You can even have a go at pulling it to see how heavy it would have been, but I don't think they were transported that way.
Oh my!
Yeah, it's just, you know, a bit of a one-minded show that I feel, but. Yeah, so that was the first phase of Stonehenge, completely different to the Stonehenge that we recognise today, for example. And that phase of Stonehenge, that lasted for about 500 years. And 56 is a good number, if you like, playing with mathematics and eclipse cycles and the Saros cycle. You can fit a lot into that model. So, and it was a really perfect circle, a very large circle of blue stones. The blue stones were so highly polished that they were, you know, a sight to behold. They were like midnight black with flexes of feldspar, that's like white quartz material, and they appeared like a star-spangled midnight sky. It was very, very beautiful. And that was the first phase. Then for reasons that aren't fully understood, they dismantled all of that, completely dismantled it all. And then they started to build the Stonehenge that we are very familiar with today. You know, the gigantic sarsen stones that were smoothed off. And they created a perfect circle of 30 standing stones with a circular band on top, which are called the lintels, inside of which was another stone circle, the blue stones of the original 56 stones in the original stone circle, placed in a circle around the sarsens, inside of which was a huge, what are called trilithons. They're like two standing stones with a great big lintel on the top in a horseshoe shape, and they are the largest of which is called the Greater Trilithon. That weighs, you know, over 25 tons.
My gosh.
Each one. I mean, it was gigantic. And as I say to people, how far down in the ground do you think these are? Apart from the Greater Trilithon, all the others down in the ground, the length of my leg. And I'm quite short, actually. So you're talking about, they're just 3 feet in the ground. But the engineering skill of keeping them upright and balanced is a miracle in itself. In fact, the Greater Trilithon and its partner only fell because some gypsies in the 18th century wanted shelter because the Salisbury Plain is windswept, and they dug down and created a hole to kind of, you know, coopy down in, and that caused the Trilithon to fall about 2 seasons later. And when it did fall, the nearest town, which is about, has to be about 4 miles or so away, that everybody in the district heard it when that stone crashed down to the floor. So that phase of Stonehenge, that was around about 2500 BC, that date where they closed down the Long Barrow. So that was when the Stonehenge we're familiar with today was erected at Stonehenge. And the altar stone, the real central piece of Stonehenge, came from Milford Haven. Again, that's, about 119 miles away from Stonehenge. And that was a very, very beautiful stone. It was green sandstone, flexed with ruby. So it had red flexes through it, and again, a bit of felspar. And that was beautiful. And the stones at Stonehenge look grey and weather-worn at the moment. They really do. But in their peak, when they were put there by ancient man, they gleamed silver. They were so highly polished. So the Stonehenge you're seeing today is not the Stonehenge that our ancestors had. It was a very colourful place. And I get truly angry with the managers of Stonehenge because they're allowing a lot of lynchings to grow on it, which is great. That is good in its own right, because that's a living plant, if you will. But it's making the tops look like green fur all around Stonehenge. And even on private access that anyone can apply to on English Heritage website, they are not allowing anybody to even touch the stones anymore. You can't touch them. You can't even go near them without a security guard now telling you to get away from the stones. So it has really become a monument isolated from the people. And that is wrong, because that is our spiritual heritage, and that is our monument.
I couldn't agree more. And I have to, my listeners and my followers I would be doing a disservice to them if I did not ask you to touch on this particular topic of the conspiracy theorists that are just going crazy right now. I don't know if you've noticed it yourself, Maria. It's all over Facebook. It's all over some of these websites like Before It's News and other conspiracy sites that Stonehenge was merely built in the 50s by Victorian Freemasons. And there are some wonderful pictures, but I can't help but say to myself, was there reconstruction perhaps in the 50s, or was this for a movie that they were doing in the 50s and they built another Stonehenge? But could you kind of qualm the fears that the Victorians did not build Stonehenge in the 50s? And what are your thoughts on this conspiracy that's going out right now?
Yeah, I can understand why people are thinking that, but there are very, very old photographs, very, very old antiquarian drawings of Stonehenge, one dating back to the 11th century in a very old English manuscript, showing what Stonehenge looked like and where it was found. So Stonehenge has been around for, quite some time, and then again around what we call the Elizabethan period here, which is around about 1536. I might be out by about 20-30 years if my history date there. I'm very good at prehistory, not so very good at medieval history. But around that time, again, it was recorded, and there was a very notorious magician to Queen Elizabeth I, Henry VIII's daughter, called Dr. John Dee. Now, Dr. John Dee had a channel with him called Edward Kelly, and they used to visit Avebury, and it was recorded by other antiquarians of that period as well, that what was perhaps hanging at Stonehenge once on one of the stones, it's very hard when you look at how they're describing it to fully understand it, was a metal plate, but they couldn't work out what type of metal it was. Some said it was lead, others said it was tin, some said it was tin, but fixed with lead, and it had these strange characters all over them. Now, in medieval Britain at that time, for instance, people knew Greek, they were learned people, and they took it to St. Paul's, it's now a cathedral in London, but then it was like a school for scholars, to see if they could decode it, and they just described it as hieroglyphs. That has again gone missing. But if you look to where that could have been at Stonehenge, there is one standing stone there that has an outline of a large rectangle And that's the dimensions of roughly what that tablet was. So that was all recorded at Stonehenge in that period.
So
But
before the 50s.
but well before the 50s, you're like
Maria,
500
do you know if they had any reconstruction or leveling of the stones in the 50s? Is there any?
Absolutely. It was led, first of all, before that, around about 1901, by Colonel Hawley. He was the first to concrete in some of the stones that he felt were dangerous and going to fall down. So he reconstructed certain parts of Stonehenge. Now, in the 1950s, led by Professor Atkinson and Stuart Piggott, they were reconstructing quite a few monuments in this area. They did the West Kennet Long Barrow near Avebury, and they re-erected a lot of Stonehenge and set it in concrete. And they used cranes because they couldn't move the stones. And there were anomalies there. For example, there was another trilithon that didn't fit in what they thought the model of Stonehenge was, which was the 5 trilithons in a horseshoe shape. And one researcher in the area assures me that they just buried it because they didn't know what to do with it.
Oh my!
And he showed me on a map where that is, and we're asking for that to be geophysed and dug up. So yes, there was a lot of reconstruction in the 1950s, and not particularly sensitively done by Professor Atkinson.
I see, and that makes complete sense to me. That's exactly what I thought it was the situation. Tell us a little bit, if you could, to switch up the topic a little bit. I'm very interested in the harmonics of whether it be Stonehenge or any of the sites that you've been a part of. Have you? I know that recently our mutual friend Gary Evans has been doing some experiments with sound, and I believe you're involved a little bit with some of that. Can you tell us what is discovering the harmonic of a stone mean? What do? Is someone hitting a tuning fork against it, or explain the idea of that if you can?
Well, Stonehenge is, as we know, it's a unique, iconic monument. But whoever and whenever it was actually designed and constructed knew about acoustic sound. They knew about acoustic sound because if you're at the center of Stonehenge, and let's say I'm stood at the center for argument's sake, and you're on the outside, you're right, say, give you a couple of meters or say 10 feet on the outside, and you now want to move a bit closer towards the stones, which you would be able to obviously see, you wouldn't be able to hear what I'm doing on the inside, despite the gaps.
Oh, wow.
So, and that's a very, very intriguing fact, which has been proved recently by Reading University, who did some recordings there. And what they discovered was, and they played it against what's called pink noise, which I don't fully understand. You'd have to go onto their website to, fully understand that. There was a background recording that they could record something on. But what they discovered really did astonish them. Sound was going, and this is sound not that you can hear, like infrasound, just below your ability to hear, goes round and round the stone circle and doesn't dissipate through the gaps. And even if I were to chant, or speak to a congregation on the inside of Stonehenge, nobody on the outside would be able to hear a word I was saying. So that is designed acoustically. It's designed in a manner that it allows sound, infrasound, to be generated around that monument that is not audible to the ear. And they, Reading University, just don't fully, again, not fully understanding what's actually happening there. So I think what the ancients were doing, they were designing temples on many different levels, maybe to, enhance our senses, take our consciousness to a different level, because I work with a mathematician because I will be writing a book on Stonehenge. It's going to be called The Secret History of Stonehenge, because there's fact after fact that is just bizarre about Stonehenge. And he looks into the mathematics of harmonics. And a harmonic in math is like when the numbers are similar, like 1 over 2, 2 over 3, 4 over 5, and things like that. And then it equates to music. And lots of, Greek scholars recognize this, like Pythagoras and Plato, many, many, many moons ago. And Stonehenge And certain stone circles within the area in which I live, and in Scotland and Ireland alike, do contain mathematical ratios that equate to music and act like gateways to different levels of consciousness. If you could, relate your mind to that harmonic. So there's so many things at these sites on different levels. Physically, you can have sound at Stonehenge, but unseen and silent to the ear, you have infrasound and unheard sounds that are mathematical harmonics equating to music. And again, it's further research, I'm sure, will discover even more stranger facts and starts to make sense, and we can see the monuments for what they are. But, I don't go down the conspiracy theory road too often. But there is something about Stonehenge that is very, very hard to even get into the site first.
And now, back to your host, Bernard Alvarez.
And welcome back to the Just Bernard Show here on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. We are having a really good conversation with Maria Wheatley about sacred places, sacred energies, water, ley lines, and so much more. And before the break, we were having some technical difficulties, but Maria, if you're there, I wanted you, if you could perhaps reiterate a little bit about the connection, the American connection. Let's try to bring it across the pond a little bit for our American listeners. And you were saying earlier that we have one of the largest henges here in the United States that nobody really talks about.
Yes, you have a lot of sites over there of real importance, actually. I mean, one of which is Newark. I mean, it has gigantic earthworks in circular shapes and square shapes. And more, if that isn't remarkable, I mean, this is a huge, huge complex. I mean, get your views to have a look at your own ancient site, especially Newark in Ohio. And one of the archaeologists from, I think it's what's called the Ohio Historical Trust, but don't quote me on that. But anyway, one of the Ohio archaeologists, he thinks that that site in Newark was linked to one 60 miles away, which is a considerable distance. But those two sites were linked by an earthen avenue, and that's like two gigantic walls up to 10 feet high, coursing across the landscape for 60 miles.
Oh, wow.
Linking that is a gigantic monument. And like I said, according to the antiquarian that looked at these sites and thankfully recorded them for posterity today, although quite a bit remains at Newark, I think part of it even may be a golf course today, but it's preserved that way. He noted in his studies, that it wasn't their peoples that built them. Now, when you look to another ancient site of Ohio, it's called Fort Ancient. And again, that was termed by, the white people fort. They thought it was a complex that was, made for defense. But it wasn't at all. It was identical to the henges over here. Because a henge has a ditch on the inside and the wall on the outside, making it a non-defensive structure. And that's called a henge. So these were henges, identical to Avebury and Stonehenge. But at Fort Ancient, it was ingenious what the builders did. They made it waterproof. And so that every year it was so waterproof and smooth that they just used to wipe off the debris of, the fall, from leaves from trees and that sort of thing. They sculptured the ground dead flat and made it a ceremonial site. But sadly, that Fort Ancient, parts of it survive today. And when antiquarians looked at the overall shape of it, it almost looked like North and South America as a symbol in earth, in the landscape. And that's remarkable. And again, it's much, much bigger than Avebury over here, which is one of our super henges. And there's two gigantic super henges linked like North and South America. It's very, very intriguing. And another ancient site that caught my eye when I was researching some of the American sites was in, I think you pronounce it Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. And it's literally a kind of pentacle shape, like your military pentagon. There's not much
Yes.
difference in the overall kind of shape of it. And the designer of the Pentagon, who was Bergstrom, he lived literally very close to that earthwork that looked like the Pentagon, and he was the designer of the Pentagon. So he would have known about this earthwork. He would have probably heard all the stories and myths associated with it, which was it was the Pentagon earthwork in America was the national sacrificial monument. It was the most sacred, holiest place in America, where lots of tribes would come together in Wisconsin. But it also had a very grisly use by the later Native American communities, because they used it for sacrifice for warriors and for oracles. And if you walked, it was said if you sacrificed somebody, then walked around 5 times, you would be able to foresee the future and, use it as an oracle base, be able to predict the outcomes of wars and things like that. And again, in the Pentagon's design, you have 5 ring corridors in the pentagon shape. So Bergstrom was very, very familiar with these designs, and I think mirrored the kind of symbolic, metaphysical aspects, the darker aspects of its later use. And that's not to say that's what it was designed for at all. It was a bit like the barrows I was describing earlier, its later day use. But I think they definitely identified with that style monument. And even in 1846, when it was being recorded by the antiquarians there, they remarked again on how smooth and perfect the lines, the kind of shape of it was. It was perfect. And again, the Native American community that was working with the antiquarians said it was the kings of kings that built this. But that was one of the most sacred places in all of America.
Oh my, I'm definitely have to look into that more. And I must say that the idea of the Pentagon in its particular shape definitely does have metaphysical and magical undertones or feelings to it, and you have to wonder why that particular shape was used for what has become the military center of the world at this point, unfortunately. And well, again, that could be a whole nother show. But
Yeah.
do you have any thoughts on that? Is there a reason? What are perhaps some of your intuitive speculations on why a shape like that would be used to house military power?
Well, for one, just by the designer's awareness of what the Native American community then were using the monument for, was to, see outcomes of war. It was to enhance the 5 senses and to get control of the land and to get control of the people and to get control of, the whole future. I mean, you're not just talking about the present, what they were thinking. This is the present, the past, and the future that they wanted control of. And they believed by blood letting, whether that was sacrifice or war or whatever, that ability would be maintained and achieved. I think sewn into the Pentagon's very foundation on the military level, that is its metaphysical beat, if you like, and it does go for control. But the other site in America, that was called the sacrificial altar, that the Pentagon in Wisconsin, and there was 5 of them placed in the landscape. So again, this number 5 keeps repeating itself, and to some traditions, it was representing the 5 senses and how to enhance them. Again, not necessarily for a good agenda, but I think overall the monuments in America, again, I don't think they've got the dating correct, because it does make me cross, coming from an archaeological background, that they use carbon dating to date a monument, whether that's in America or in the UK, because worms, unbelievably, can move large objects. And that may sound like kind of crazy, but there was a big experiment done at Oxford University in 1995 to prove the point. And they placed a large fish tank of earth, and they put kind of dead rats and mice on the top, and they wanted to see what the worms could do and if they could move the bones around, which were much, much bigger than the worms themselves. And indeed they did. They could drag them down and up. So worms can change the whole carbon dating of a place. You see what I mean? If you've got a bit of debris, they can move it up, which will make it look like a younger monument, or they can move it down to make it look like an older monument. So the dating, I think, is completely a bit of a nonsense. But if you use the archaeological dating for some of the American sites, they say they're relatively modern. And I find it really remarkable that if that indeed is the case, then why is it the exact height of those henge banks, which roughly estimate at 18 feet by 30 feet wide, which is quite colossal, are the same at Darrington Walls? The same at Avebury. It was like a universal standard measurement used in America for their henge monuments that were used over here. I mean, that's either a big coincidence, or maybe they are far older in America, or maybe after the building phase over here, people travelled from this country and built henge monuments over there. I do think they're probably more contemporary, although that is very controversial, and normally they're attributed to the Hopewell culture or the Adena Indians, but I don't think that is the case.
You know, I find it very fascinating because right now we are finding more and more sacred sites in the United States. As a matter of fact, I believe they found another one recently here in the state of Virginia. I believe it was a gentleman was in his backyard and found a henge buried in his backyard here in Virginia, which I found to be very interesting, to say the least. But I like the idea of what you're saying, that perhaps it was I don't know if it was a global cultural connection, perhaps maybe there were ice bridges or something where people were able to go back and forth, almost as if I forgot who it was I was speaking with about the pyramids, that perhaps it was a collective consciousness connection, that there was something to perhaps the mystical work that they were doing that was bringing them these images and or shapes and or placement for these particular monuments. Have you looked into any of that as well?
Well, I haven't personally, but there's quite a famous chap over here called Rupert Sheldrake, who's done a lot of experiments with what he calls the morphogenic fields, or your collective unconscious. You know, whatever terminology we use, they kind of mean the same thing. And he did an experiment with rats. The rats end up okay, so no worries. And what he did was he built like a show jumping. You know, horses do show jumping, and they remember a route, don't they?
Yeah.
And a way to go round the circuit, so to speak. And he put some rats in London and some rats in New York, identical show jumping circuit, so they could eventually go round the right way and get some food. And that was the kind of exercise for the rats. Once they learned it in London, miles away from New York, it was encoded in their collective unconscious. They repeated it exactly first time round and got the food. So we are linked by a kind of energetic field that we can communicate in. And it was noted in the Second World War, for example, you know, if somebody had a breakthrough with, you know, atomic research in one part of the world, it would be repeated in another part. So, you know, you've got a lot of people used to really try and hide their theories and their ideas during the war, and they wouldn't repeat it even in their head in case it would be, you know, found out and discovered by the then enemy. So yes, we are definitely linked, and we can, I think, communicate on different levels of our consciousness. And I do believe in the morphogenic fields or collective unconscious theory. It does explain a lot. But also, I think people did travel vast distances as well. And I think we were far more mobile, whether that was through ships or through other types of technological achievements, to cover these vast distances. And I don't think, you know, the Atlantic Ocean would stop discovery if indeed you had other lost continents, not just Atlantis, but maybe islands that have now gone because of rising and falling sea levels. You know, the coastal lines have changed, not considerably, but I think we were sea travelers.
Yeah, me too. I get the instinction or the instinct that that's exactly what was going on. We were probably much more adept than we were shown or being told by mainstream history, definitely. Now, Maria, we have about 10 more minutes left, not even, and I wanted to make sure that we talked a little bit about some of the. I know we covered many issues and topics today, but can you tell us a little bit about what your book and what it's focusing on, divining ancient stone circles? What is the main key subject matter?
Well, the subject matter is looking at ancient sites, specific ancient sites across the world, and looking at the Earth energy patterns and the design canons of the energies and why they were sited where they are, whether that was on the grid or with the Earth energies and the layers that connect them. And I look in depth at what different types of energies and what they kind of do to us as well, how they influence us in ways that we don't necessarily recognize when we go to the site. So it's a book about ancient sites, mysticism, consciousness, and how Earth energies changed cultures. Because by interacting with these sites, I mean, you probably feel it yourself. You'll go somewhere where you think is calm and sacred, or just have that moment of calm, even in a park around nature, and we change and we feel differently. I think what the ancients were doing, and I explain this in the book, they were tapping into the earth for various different reasons. One was, energy, practical energy, like we have electricity today, and the other side was very beneficial to our health. And I give examples of how we can do that today, because one way we can do that is we can tap into the place where we were born. I mean, it was in the 1960s at Stanford University, actually, that the vivaxis principle, which I discuss in the book, was found, and that's at the time of your birth. I mean, all the time that you were growing in your mum's womb, you were attuning to the magnetic field of your environment, wherever it was, your mum was when she was pregnant. So your bones and everything became magnetized to the place and the location of where you were born. And by tapping into that, which was discovered by Francis Nixon and verified by Stanford University, although it never made headlines, never made media attention. And that's one way we can tap into our mineral content of where we were born through simple exercises that are outlined and that have been used since literally the 60s, and go back to our mineralization zone of whence we were born. And the idea was behind the vivaxis principle was that at the moment when the mum has her labor pains, that's when all living creatures, they start to realign their magnetic field within the womb, and that starts the mother's labor pains. And I look about how we can work with earth energies on that level through other people's research and my own additional research onto that, because I think once we can tap into those vital energies, metaphysical minerals as well as actual minerals, we become healthier and more vibrant.
That sounds wonderful, and it's a wonderful, how shall I say, a school of thought for us to consider further and to move into and investigate more. I can't help but agree with you as far as how much we are magnetized to our place of birth. I myself, I'm still drawn to it, and I lived there for 2 years out of my entire life, and I find it very fascinating, and not just in a curiosity way, but every time I go there, I feel very at home. And I know that sounds strange. I never really lived there, but I can relate to everything that you're talking about with that, and feeling healthier. I think some of the greatest years of my life were when I lived there as a early in my early 20s. I lived there, even though I was born there as a child and never lived there as a child. I went back in my 20s, and I would say I what's the word? I thrived. I thrived the years that I was there, and it was absolutely wonderful. And actually, that's where I had my shamanic experience, where I got in contact with the light beings that I've been working with. And
Oh, wow.
if it wasn't for living where I lived, I never would have met the shaman who would have trained me to do the work that I did to come in contact with the light beings that I'm working with.
Mm.
So it's funny how these things play out in the big picture, in the big scheme of things. With that being said, let's talk a little bit about your tour, because I really wish I could go on some of these tours. Unfortunately, I'm not time-wise or financially capable at this time, but I would love to hear more about your tour with Gary and where you guys are going to be going, and what types of programs you're going to be offering during the tour.
Sure. I mean, our tour starts off on July the 12th in Ireland. And Ireland is a wonderful country in its own right. And it has some of the most ancient monuments that predate Avebury and Stonehenge, and what we consider to be very old monuments here in England, by 1,000 years. So you're going way back in time. And,
Wow.
and some people, yeah, it's very old. It's called Sligo in Ireland. So it's ancient. It really is. And what a lot of researchers have come to understand about Sligo is that it could have even been the first outpost of Atlantis, because it's very ancient, it's very old. We'll be interacting with the earth energies there. Gary will be looking at the acoustic side of the sites.
Nice.
And we'll be, which as you know, it's fascinating to experience that. And we'll be experiencing the sound resonance in each of the sites as well. So they will be true temple spaces. And we'll be going to Newgrange as well. And Newgrange is a wonderful long barrow, but to be truthful to your listeners, it is a bit commercial. So we have chosen the non-commercial sites as well that give you true identity of temple space and times gone by. Because I think, Newgrange is like Stonehenge. You get on the bus, you're dropped off on the bus.
Right.
We'll be going to some wonderful, wonderful places that don't have that kind of energy, and we can really go back in time. And some are a bit of a walk, some of our sites. So you have to kind of be prepared to walk in the footsteps of your ancestors, but some of them are beautiful.
Maria, we only have a few more seconds. Can you tell everybody where they can get information on the tour?
Yeah, you can go to my website, which is www.theaveburyexperience.co.uk, or go to infiniteconnections.com, and you can get all the itinerary, all of the places we're going to go, because we're not just going to Ireland, we're going to Stonehenge and Avebury in England as well. So it's a tour of a lifetime for those that have the time and the money to do so. And we'll be met by other guides and other guests, and we'll be staying in some castles as well.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Maria, and thank you everyone for listening. We will see you next week with Nick Villardes here on the Just Bernard Show. Have a great week, everyone. We love you.
There is no denying the world is awakening. We see it in the global uprisings and demonstrations of the people around the planet, and the new way of thinking and living that is arising naturally within each one of us and our communities. I have been a major player in this global shift and movement for over 20 years and have helped tens of thousands of people around the world change their lives and find their voice in order to help create the paradigm change we so desperately need. Join me here at Revolution Radio on the Just Bernard Show every Tuesday at noon Eastern Time for 2 hours of powerful interviews and discussion with some of the most influential visionaries of consciousness, alternative media, and suppressed knowledge. We promise to reveal the real matrix and empower your human experience.